So today in the Sermon on the Mount, we're coming up to a logical step for Jesus to take after teaching about divorce, which involved vows and breaking vows. So he's going to be teaching on this whole issue of oaths, taking vows, swearing. So that's what we want to take a look at. So when you, just to review back kind of to where we've come from in the Sermon on the Mount, at least in this section, chapter 5, starting at, I can't remember exactly the verse, but the part where he says, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven, which is quite a statement. And so this is 6 examples that Jesus is giving us of the difference between the righteousness of the Pharisees and what the righteousness of the kingdom of heaven is. So we get 6 examples. The first being, and it's very important that we understand, he puts anger and murder and violence, all that, the very first thing, because that is something that's just right at the root of problems between human beings. And a lot of this is primarily not so much about our relationship to God, but our relationships with other people and how we relate to other people. Of course, God plays a major role, but that's just where his focus is. And so he talks about that. Then he goes into the second and he talks about adultery, lust, and how primarily in that society, men basically saw women as objects to be used for their own pleasure. And so that leads into the marriage thing with the divorce. And if the wife wasn't, doing everything that the husband liked, or if he saw somebody else or whatever, he could simply get a certificate of divorce and divorce his wife and put her out in the cold. And so you can see this, there's a very logical progression here that Jesus is following. And so now we come to this next section on oaths. And I always kind of wondered, okay, this is kind of a weird one. How does this kind of fit in? Well, again, Jesus in these 6 examples is going to really the heart of what it means to be a follower of Christ. What the righteousness of the kingdom of heaven looks like. And it's so, in such contrast to what the people have been taught by the religious experts, the Pharisees, the scribes, the people they call them lawyers, but they're basically Bible scholars. And this is what they've heard all their life. And here comes Jesus saying, that righteousness, the way to live that's being told to you won't get you into the kingdom of heaven. That was quite a thing to say. So here we go. I'm calling this, and this is really at the heart of what Jesus is getting at, the ruthless elimination of dishonesty. Just as we had the ruthless elimination of anger, of lust, and now dishonesty. So here's the old way, and this is how he starts. He's got this pattern that he follows. You have heard it was said. In verse 33, again, you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. Well, let's just stop there and take a look, because our practice of oaths is very different than what was taking place back there in the sense of people's worldview, how people viewed spiritual reality and just physical reality. So going back to Jesus' time, this would have been, during the Roman Empire, and it probably was true even much earlier. Oaths, they weren't just promises. They weren't just promises. They were solemn, and I got this off of, I just always ask my AI guy, he's really helpful. He brings all this. They were solemn, legally binding religious contracts. This is primarily in Israel. To break an oath was to invite immediate divine wrath or execution. Because both societies were highly litigious, is that how you say that? And deeply religious. Distinct categories of oaths governed everyday military and legal life. So this, they really believed. We always say, well, God's going to send down a lightning strike or something like that. We're just joking. They believed it. This was very serious stuff. And in the first century Jewish society, oaths and vows were just common everyday fixtures. Jesus wasn't picking some random thing that really didn't have much to do with people's life. This was something that was all in their lives. Everybody was very familiar with this. It says, due to strict Pharisaic and scribal traditions, a complex legal web dictated exactly which wording made an oath legally binding. So this isn't just it's not simple, it's complicated. That's why I'm calling this the old way that Jesus is contrasting with here. It's this taking oaths is complicated. It's complicated swearing an oath. It complicates your life. So there were what they called substitutionary oaths. In other words, evasive swearing, to avoid taking the actual name of God in vain, which was a violation of the commandments. People swore by sacred objects. Common examples recorded during this area included, and we get this in the sermon, by heaven, by the earth, by Jerusalem, or by my own head. Jesus is going to use those as examples. It's kind of like, it's like Christians, we got our own cuss words, because we know we can't say the bad words, but we've got to say something when we hit our thumb with a hammer, right? So we've got our own, like, shoot, darn. So that's a substitutionary kind of oaths, and they're kind of loopholes. Underneath it's the same thing, but you're not directly addressing God. Although a lot of ours is, God, And then there was the temple hierarchy loophole. The literal wording of an oath determined its validity. For instance, scribes taught that swearing by the temple was not binding, but swearing by the gold of the temple was. Similarly, swearing by the altar was meaningless, but swearing by the gift on the altar or the sacrifice, that bound a person completely. So they're creating loopholes. There's the prohibitive vow. And this is that whole thing about Corban, so a person could say about their wealth or whatever, that it's Corban, and that means it's devoted or dedicated to God as a sacrifice in order to not have to use their resources to help take care of their parents. judicial oaths of innocence. In local rabbinic courts, if property went missing under a neighbor's care and there were no witnesses, the caretaker was required to take a formal oath before God to clear their name and absolve themselves of financial liability. So all you got to do is, no, I didn't, no, it wasn't me, I didn't do it, take an oath and get you off the hook. Very interesting to found this. You've heard of the community of the Essenes? The Essene community that lived more out away from the urban areas of Jerusalem, out in the wilderness, kind of like a monastery. That's where we got the Dead Sea Scrolls, was from them. They strictly prohibited taking daily oaths. That was in contrast to what the majority of the culture was practicing. They believed that anyone who required an oath to be believed was already a liar. And that's interesting. Well, Jesus, he was up in Galilee, and the Essenes were down in the south, so I don't know that there was really very much contact between the two, but the thinking is very similar here. And that's kind of what Jesus is getting at here in this, is that the whole point of oaths and everything was to validate your integrity. In other words, your integrity isn't trustworthy. Your integrity is not something we can trust, so we got to make something else more binding to kind of force you to follow through on an oath. But then there's the Romans, and they had their own kind of vows. A lot of them were kind of similar, not quite, obviously they weren't centered around the law or around God, but they were centered around their gods. So they would invoke their gods based on gender and social status. Men routinely swore, "Me Hercule." That means by Hercules. I don't know if this is Latin or whatever they're using. And while women swore, "Me Castor," that's by Castor, and that's some goddess. Swearing, "Per Lovum," and that's by Jupiter. They said those were just standard practices that guaranteed honesty in business transactions. And then there's legal, I don't know how you say that, decisory oaths. In Roman civil courts, judges could employ a unique mechanism to settle an ambiguous lawsuit. The plaintiff could formally challenge the defendant to take a divine oath stating that they were innocent. If the defendant bravely took the oath, they won the lawsuit instantly. So if you're a really good liar, you win the lawsuit. If they refused out of fear of divine retribution, remember, they kind of seriously thought bad things could happen, they lost the case automatically. Can you imagine the day having a law like that? If you'll just take this oath. Now, we have our own kind of oaths that we take, but man, they're really trivial compared to what they were doing back there. We say like pinky swear, or a pinky promise, or this is the one, childhood oath, cross my heart and hope to die. Really? Or stick a needle in my eye. I'll swear on a stack of Bibles. I swear on my mother's grave. Or I swear to God, or I swear by God. And I've heard a lot of people use that one. Or if you go and you're called to a witness on the stand, you might get something where you have to swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I don't know if they still say, "So help me God," or not, if they've taken that out or not. But there's force behind that, because if you're found to lie while you're under oath. It's always this, you are under oath. Remember, you are under oath. You could get some hefty fines and time in jail if you don't tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So there is some consequences to that. Now, the problem with oaths back then and today is that they are used because there's an assumption that people can't be trusted to keep their word. That's the bottom line. Jesus knew that nothing outside of a person, a pinky, a Bible, God's temple, or even God himself, will be able to produce truth if a person is not inwardly truthful. According to Jesus, oaths are evil because they are inherently a wrong approach to how to trust other human beings. There's a quote from my good friend, I wish, Dallas Willard. The essence of swearing or making oaths is to try to use something that, though impressive, is irrelevant to the issues at hand, to get others to believe you and let you have your way. So it's a form of manipulation. And that is wrong. It is unlike God. It is trying to bypass a person's understanding and judgment to trigger their will and pressure them for our purposes. As God's free creatures, people are to be left to make their decisions without coercion or manipulation. And we've always been, get the salesman who comes up, man, and they don't want you to really think about it. They want to get you so taken with whatever they want to sell you that you can't refuse it. And that's what advertising is all about, is to trigger that desire in you, bypass the intellect to really think about what it is, to get you to want something. That's the bottom line of what it, and how they can do that. You've heard like subliminal suggestions and all this other kind of stuff. They want product recognition. That's why there's a lot of advertising, because they know that if you go into a grocery store and you see a whole lot of product, different brands, you're going to pick the one brand that you've heard about. I mean, they must be more legitimate than these others because I haven't heard about them. And it's all about manipulation and subtle coercion of us to conform to what they want. And so swearing is basically, bottom line, it's a form of dishonesty, or it's an admission that a person's word is not enough to be trusted. Something else external to the person must be invoked to bind a person to a particular action. It's also a way for us to justify ourselves in the minds of other people. It's a way to trick or manipulate others to think that we're good. We use the word righteous, or, hey, I'm okay. Very interesting in the news today that the federal government is considering requiring all federal employees to have to sign a non-disclosure agreement, NDA. That isn't what they're doing now. And if you're a new hire and you want to get hired, you have to sign it or you won't get hired. If you are already working and you don't sign it, then you get fired. It's because they don't trust their employees. Now, that's the old way. That's how it kind of operates in the world. It's operating under the assumption that a person's word, you really can't trust it. Now, Jesus' way is, it's just really so simple. It's very simple. It's simple honesty and integrity. That's what Jesus says. He says, I say to you, but I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black, but let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything beyond these, get that, anything beyond that, he says, is evil. It's evil. So it's very simple. Be an honest, truthful person of integrity. That's what Jesus is saying. Period. He says, don't view people as means to achieve what you want. Don't see other people as basically existing to serve you. Don't view God that way. God doesn't exist just to serve us. We exist to serve God, right? It's the same thing, same way with people. As we need to see other people as those that we can serve. In fact, he goes on later on to say that, who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? The one who is the servant of all. It says, whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted. So it's all about honesty. It's all about being truthful so that people can say, yeah, he said it. If he said it, that's the case. That's true. It used to be a thing where people said, his word is as good as gold, You don't hear that too much anymore. But that's the way a lot of times, and earlier on in our history here in the United States, that's how bargains were made. We didn't have, people doing contracts and everything on the scale that we do now. Shake hands, yeah, the good handshake. Now everybody, medical profession, they've got to cover their bases and be legally covered. Well, you guys know that you've got to make due diligence to make sure you've done all these things if you want to get your insurance payout or whatever. It's just we're so, that word, litigious, we're just, we just don't live on the basis of that people are trustworthy, and with good reason. But I'm going to close with just this little exercise. And I've talked to this, I do this a lot, but it's an exercise, and it's a really good exercise to put this into perspective, what Jesus is saying. It's called the just imagine exercise. Just imagine a world without lying, without dishonesty, where oaths are completely irrelevant. It would just be, why? Why would you do that? That's the world, the kingdom that Jesus came into this world to offer us. That's why it's called the upside down kingdom, because it turns the way this world operates completely on its head, upside down. The way that's expected, the way that people assume you should have to operate. And that's why what Jesus' words, so often in the Sermon on the Mount, we just say, well, we can't do that because it's so foreign. It's so idealistic that obviously he didn't expect us to be able to do this. Although at the end of the sermon, we find out, no, he really did, that this is something that human beings can move into, can enter into. This is entering into the kingdom, is when we begin to take his words, put them into practice, and we begin to experience the reality of it. And all of that assumes that we have faith in Jesus, that we trust him, that he knows what he's talking about, that we can give our life to him, and knowing full well that if we operate on this basis, we're going to get cheated. We're going to get lied to. We're going to get taken advantage of. And he's going to go on in the next section where he's going to talk about, well, if somebody wants to take your coat, give them your cloak, and somebody slaps you on the right, because he knows that's the world that we live in, the way it operates. But that's not the way it's going to be in his kingdom. And we begin to demonstrate what heaven is like in our interactions with one another. That's why it's so destructive when churches can't get along. And and people see this, and it's like, hey, what's the difference? So it's, again, Jesus is taking something that if you just read over, it seems like, oh yeah, it's, what is this? He is going right to the heart of what human life is all about. And if we don't operate from a position of honesty, transparency in our own lives, then we don't have anything to hide in that sense. We begin to appreciate why the Sermon on the Mount has been so relevant for all these years. It's so powerful. There's no better way to live. Well, so that's the just imagine exercise. Just imagine. Okay, amen. Close right there.